Hello, welcome to the Learn English Lab. Today's podcast topic, the influence of childhood experiences C1 level English listening practice.
It's a really fundamental topic, isn't it?
It absolutely is. You know, have you ever really stopped to think, really ponder how much of who you are right now, the way you react to things, your relationships, maybe even how you pick up new skills is, fundamentally shaped by what happened when you were really young?
It's one of those thoughts that really gives you pause.
Yeah.
And it's exactly what this wealth of information we're looking at today dives into. Those early years, they're not just, a warm-up act for life.
No, not at all.
They're actually building the blueprint,
the
foundation for the person we become.
Yeah, that's the heart of it. That's what we're getting into in this deep dive. We're exploring all this material research findings, different perspectives, all focusing on this one big idea. The really profound influence of our childhood experiences.
Right. And our mission here is to sort of navigate through all this knowledge, pull out the really key insights, and try to get a solid grasp on the core arguments about how these formative years, sculpt us across so many different areas.
And it really is across the board, isn't it? We're talking personality, how we think, how we learn our cognitive development.
And our emotional regulation, too, how we handle feelings.
Yeah, handling feelings, and then how we interact with other people, our social behavior. It's incredibly complex when you start to unravel it. And the information draws from so many fields to psychology, obviously, but also neuroscience.
Sociology, education. They all bring a different piece to the puzzle.
Definitely. So the plan for this deep dive, our roadmap, if you will, is to start with some of the big theories, the foundational ideas that help us frame this whole discussion.
Okay. And then move into the brain's role, the neuroscience bit.
Exactly. How experience physically shapes the brain. Then we'll look at different kinds of experiences, the good, the bad, the just plain different.
And resilience comes into that too, I imagine, how some kids thrive despite challenges.
Yes, absolutely. Resilience and protective factors. We'll also touch on education's role, because that's a huge mediating factor. And finally, circle back to the really long-term impacts right across the lifespan, and maybe what can be done, like interventions or policy ideas.
It's like a comprehensive journey. It all ties together, though, doesn't it?
It really does. So let's start at the beginning with those foundational theories. Where does the thinking on this really start?
Well, to really understand the how, you kind of need these frameworks. They've been developed over time, and they give us different ways to look at why early life is just so crucial.
And one of the biggest ones, it comes up again and again, is attachment theory. John Bowlby's work seems central here.
Oh, absolutely. Bowlby's core idea was pretty revolutionary at the time. He argued that infants, human babies, are basically biologically programmed to seek closeness with their main caregivers.
Like an instinct.
Exactly, an instinct. It wasn't just about food or physical needs. It was about survival. Staying close to a protective adult was key in our evolutionary past. And this drive to connect creates what he termed a secure base.
The secure base. I remember that concept. It's like having a safe haven, right? A place the child trusts, knows they can return to for comfort and safety.
Precisely that. It's the emotional anchor. And having that feeling of safety, that secure base, is what actually gives the child the confidence to, go out and explore the world.
Makes sense. You need to feel safe before you can be adventurous.
And then Mary Ainsworth, she took Bowlby's ideas and really ran with them. She developed this observational procedure called the strange situation.
Yes, the one with the separations and reunions.
That's the one. It was a structured way to see how infants responded to brief separations from their caregiver and then their reunion. And through these observations, she identified these distinct patterns of behavior, which she grouped into 4 main attachment styles.
Okay, what are those 4 styles?
They are secure attachment, anxious ambivalent attachment, avoidant attachment, and then a 4th, more complex one called disorganized attachment. And each style reflects the history of the interactions the child has had.
And points towards different developmental pathways later on.
That's the crucial link, yes.
Yeah.
The patterns aren't just interesting instant behaviors. They tend to predict future functioning.
So let's break those down. Secure attachment, that sounds like the goal, the most positive one.
It generally is considered the most adaptive style, yes. It typically develops when caregivers are consistently available, sensitive to the baby's signals, and responsive to their needs. The child learns, okay, I can count on this person. They'll be there for me.
And that builds trust and safety.
Right. And that allows them to explore with confidence and the long-term benefits. Well, studies consistently find that children who are securely attached in infancy tend to grow up to be more socially competent.
Better at making friends, navigating social situations.
Yes, and also better at understanding and managing their own emotions, emotional regulation. And interestingly, there's often a link to better academic performance later on, even into adolescence. Some large studies, like the NICHD research, back this up.
So it really sets a strong foundation.
Think about it. If a child learns early on that seeking comfort works, that someone reliable is there, they build this internal sense of security. It helps them cope with stress later, try new things. It fosters resilience.
Okay, so that's secure. What about the insecure styles? How do they come about?
Insecure attachments usually stem from caregiving that's, well, less reliable, might be inconsistent or rejecting or perhaps intrusive. Let's take the anxious ambivalent style.
Okay.
This often links to caregiving that's unpredictable. Maybe the parent is warm and responsive sometimes, but other times unavailable or dismissive. So the child never knows quite what to expect.
That sounds confusing for a baby.
It is. And these children often become quite clingy, very anxious about separation. They might seek closeness desperately, but then paradoxically resist comfort when it's offered, almost like they're angry or unsure. This anxiety about the caregiver's availability often carries forward into relationships later.
A kind of constant worry about being abandoned or rejected.
Something like that, yeah. Now, the avoidance style is different. This tends to develop when caregivers are consistently emotionally distant, unavailable, or perhaps regularly rebuff the child's attempts to seek closeness or comfort.
So the child learns not to bother asking.
Pretty much. They learn that expressing needs doesn't work, or might even lead to rejection. So they adapt by suppressing their natural desire for connection. They might appear overly independent, almost like little adults.
But that comes at a cost, presumably.
Oh, definitely. While they might seem self-sufficient, individuals with an avoidant attachment history often struggle significantly with emotional intimacy and vulnerability in close adult relationships. Letting someone in feels risky.
It's like they've built a wall. And the last one, disorganized. That sounds more serious.
It is generally associated with more problematic outcomes. Disorganized attachment often emerges from backgrounds involving trauma, abuse, severe neglect, or situations where the caregiver is frightening or highly unpredictable themselves. The child is caught in a paradox. The person who should be their source of safety is also a source of fear.
How does that show up in their behavior?
You see really confusing or contradictory behaviors. The child might approach the caregiver for comfort, but then suddenly freeze or back away or show fear. They might seem dazed or disoriented. Research strongly links this pattern to a higher risk for significant mental health issues down the road. Problems with emotional regulation, dissociation. It's a tough start.
Wow. So these early interactions really do lay down these deep patterns for how we connect or don't connect with others.
They absolutely form a kind of internal working model, a blueprint for relationships, and the long-term data is quite compelling. You mentioned longitudinal studies.
Yeah, studies that follow people over time.
Exactly. Like the Minnesota longitudinal study of risk and adaptation. It's a classic. They followed individuals from infancy right through into their 30s.
And what did they find about attachment?
The links were clear. Secure attachment in infancy was a robust predictor of better mental health outcomes in adulthood, more stable and satisfying romantic partnerships, and just generally greater resilience in dealing with life's stresses.
And the insecure styles.
On the other side, insecure attachment patterns in infancy were consistently linked with higher rates of anxiety disorders, depression, and ongoing difficulties in interpersonal relationships in adult life.
It really hammers home how critical that early caregiving environment is. It's not just about keeping the baby fed and warm.
No, it's about building the capacity for trust, for emotional security, for healthy connections that can last a lifetime. It's truly foundational for our social and emotional selves.
Okay, so that's the relational piece. Let's shift gears a bit and talk about how our minds develop, how we learn to think. That brings us to Jean Piaget, right?
Piaget, yes. His work on cognitive development offers a completely different angle. He wasn't focused on emotional bonds so much as on how children actively construct their understanding of the world.
Active construction meaning they're not just passive recipients of information.
Not at all. In his view, he saw children as inherently curious, like little scientists constantly experimenting, interacting with their environment, and figuring things out. They build their knowledge structures or schemas through experience.
And he famously proposed that this happens in stages, a kind of developmental sequence.
Correct. He outlined 4 major stages that children progress through in a generally fixed order. The first is the sensorimotor stage.
Birth to about 2 years old.
Roughly, yes. In this stage, infants learn primarily through their senses touching, tasting, seeing, hearing, and through their physical actions on the world, grasping, pulling, pushing. A major achievement here is developing object permanence.
Understanding that things still exist even when you can't see them, like peekaboo losing its magic.
Exactly. Before object permanence, out of sight is literally out of mind. Developing that concept is a huge cognitive leap.
Okay, what's next?
Then comes the pre-operational stage, typically from around age 2 to 7. This is where symbolic thought explodes. Children start using language extensively. They engage in imaginative pretend play.
Using a banana as a telephone.
Perfect example. They understand symbols.
Right.
However, their thinking is still quite intuitive, not yet logical by adult standards. They tend to be egocentric, finding it hard to grasp another person's perspective, and they struggle with concepts like conservation.
Conservation.
The idea that quantity stays the same, even if the appearance changes. Like pouring water from a short, wide glass into a tall, thin one, a pre-operational child might insist the tall glass has more water because it looks higher.
Okay, I see. Then comes concrete operational.
Yes, roughly ages 7 to 11. Now, logical thinking starts to emerge, but it's generally tied to concrete, tangible things they can see or manipulate. They master conservation. They can understand classification and seriation, ordering things. They can perform mental operations like addition and subtraction, but
abstract ideas are still difficult.
right. Thinking about hypothetical situations or abstract concepts like justice or algebraic variables is still a challenge. That comes in the final stage, formal operational.
Which starts around adolescence, 12 or so.
Typically, yes, and continues into adulthood. This stage marks the development of abstract reasoning. Individuals can think hypothetically, what if? They can reason systematically, consider multiple possibilities, and grapple with complex abstract ideas.
Okay, so that's the framework. How do childhood experiences fit into this? How do they influence moving through these stages?
Experiences are the fuel for this cognitive engine, according to Piaget. Children don't just mature into the next stage automatically. They need to interact with the world, manipulate objects, encounter problems that challenge their current way of thinking. That's what drives cognitive growth.
So the environment needs to provide the right kind of stimulation.
Precisely. And the material gives a great example with language development. Think about a child growing up in a really rich linguistic environment.
Lots of talking, reading, storytelling.
Exactly. Being read to, engaged in conversations, hearing complex sentences. This exposure doesn't just teach them words. It actively shapes their developing language skills, their understanding of grammar, and seems to boost cognitive flexibility, the ability to think about things in different ways.
And there was that famous study about the word gap.
Yes, the Hart and Risley study. It was striking. They found that by age 3, children from higher socioeconomic backgrounds had heard, on average, millions more words than children from lower SES families.
30 million more words, wasn't it? A staggering difference.
It was huge. And crucially, this early difference in language exposure wasn't just temporary. It was linked to persistent gaps in vocabulary size, reading skills, and overall cognitive performance later in their schooling.
It really shows how that early input provides the building blocks.
It absolutely does. And the flip side is also true, sadly. The material mentions research on children raised in environments with severe deprivation, like some poorly run orphanages or institutions.
What did that show?
These studies often find significant delays in both cognitive and language development. This is frequently attributed to the lack of consistent, responsive interaction and the lack of adequate cognitive stimulation during those critical early years when the brain is primed for this kind of learning.
It makes intuitive sense. If you don't have opportunities to explore, to be talked to solve little problems, how can those cognitive skills develop properly?
You need that interaction, that environmental input to build the mental structures. So yes, these findings really highlight how profoundly early experiences shape our fundamental thinking abilities, which obviously has huge implications for academic achievement and learning throughout life.
Okay, so we've got attachment looking at relationships, Piaget at the developing mind. But kids don't develop in a vacuum, do they? This brings us to Uri Bronfenbrenner and his ecological systems theory.
Bronfenbrenner's model is fantastic because it really emphasizes context. He argued that you can't understand child development just by looking at the child or even just their immediate family. You have to consider the multiple layers of environment that influence them.
Layers, like nested circles.
Exactly like nested circles or Russian dolls. He identified 5 interconnected systems, The innermost one is the microsystem.
That's the immediate environment.
Yes, the places and people the child interacts with directly and regularly. Family, school, childcare settings, peers, the immediate neighborhood. These are the settings where face-to-face interactions occur. Think of a supportive family promoting security, or a positive school environment fostering learning. That's the microsystem at work.
Okay, what's the next layer out?
That's the mesosystem. This isn't a separate place, but rather the connections or linkages between the different parts of the child's microsystem.
Like how home and school interact.
Perfect example. Strong, positive communication between parents and teachers. That's a supportive mesosystem link that benefits the child. Conflict or lack of connection between home and school. That can create tension or inconsistency for the child. It's about how the different immediate settings work together or don't.
Got it. Moving further out, we have the exosystem.
The exosystem includes settings that the child doesn't directly participate in, but that still affect them indirectly through their influence on the microsystem.
Like the parent's workplace.
Exactly.
Yeah.
A parent's job, stress, work hours, or whether they lose their job, these things definitely impact the family environment and the child, even though the child isn't in the workplace. Other examples might be community health services, the local school board's decisions, or availability of social support networks for the parents.
So things that affect the child's world, even if they're not in that specific setting.
Right. And then the broadest layer is the macro system.
The big picture stuff.
The biggest picture. This encompasses the overarching cultural values, beliefs, laws, economic conditions, political ideologies, and social norms of the society the child lives in. Things like cultural attitudes towards education, gender roles, individualism versus collectivism, or the presence of systemic racism or poverty. But these all shape the context within which all the other systems operate.
So the cultural air we breathe, essentially.
In a way, yes. And finally, Bronfenbrenner added the chronosystem.
Chrono meaning time.
Yes. The chronosystem represents the dimension of time changes that occur over the child's life course, or changes in the larger socio-historical context. This could be personal events like a parental divorce, moving house, or the birth of a sibling. Or it could be larger societal shifts like an economic recession, a war, or major technological changes like the internet revolution. These time-based changes influence development by altering the environmental systems.
Wow. Okay, so it's this incredibly dynamic, interconnected web. It's not just one thing influencing a child.
Not at all. And the power of the model is showing how these systems interact. The material gives the example of a child in a low-income neighborhood. They might face challenges at the microsystem level, maybe under-resourced schools, the exosystem level, lack of local job opportunities for parents, limited community services, all situated within a macrosystem of societal inequality. It's the interplay that's key.
It really highlights why a holistic view is so necessary. You can't just focus on the child alone.
Absolutely. And it also suggests that positive influences in one system, say a really supportive teacher in the microsystem or a great community program in the exosystem, can help buffer or compensate for risks or challenges in other systems. It gives us a map for thinking about where interventions might be most effective.
Okay, these theories provide powerful ways to conceptualize how childhood matters. But let's get down to the nuts and bolts. How does this actually happen inside us biologically? Let's talk about the brain.
This is where it gets really fascinating, linking the experiences to the physical structures. The brain undergoes just incredible growth and change in early childhood, especially those first, say, 5 years. It's a period of massive construction.
And the key concept here is plasticity, right? The brain's ability to change.
Exactly. Neuroplasticity. It means the brain isn't hardwired from birth. Its structure and function are shaped by experience. This involves two main processes: creating vast numbers of new connections, synapses between neurons.
Building the network.
Building the communication network, yes. And also a process called pruning, where connections that aren't used frequently are eliminated. It's like sculpting experience guides. Which connections get strengthened and kept, and which ones fade away. Use it or lose it, essentially.
And the shaping process particularly affects some key brain areas.
Yes, areas crucial for higher level functioning. The material points specifically to the prefrontal cortex that's right at the front of the brain, responsible for our executive functions.
Planning, decision-making, controlling impulses.
All of that. Working memory. Attention control is the brain's command center. Also, the hippocampus, which is vital for learning and forming new memories, and the amygdala, which is central to processing emotions, particularly fear and threat, and regulating our stress response.
So positive, nurturing experiences actually help build these areas stronger.
That's what the evidence strongly suggests. Things like consistent, responsive caregiving, rich learning opportunities, play, feeling safe and secure. These kinds of experiences stimulate healthy development in these critical regions. Research using brain imaging, like the study by Noble and colleagues mentioned, found that children from more enriched environments showed greater cortical thickness, basically, more developed brain tissue in areas supporting language and executive functions.
And that physical difference translates to better skills.
Yes, these structural differences correlate with better cognitive performance and improved emotional regulation. Positive experiences literally provide the building materials and instructions for optimal brain wiring.
Okay, but what about the opposite? What happens under conditions of adversity or chronic stress?
This is where the process can be significantly disrupted. Experiences like abuse, neglect, ongoing conflict, or deep poverty can trigger the body's stress response system repeatedly. This floods the developing brain with stress hormones, primarily cortisol.
And too much cortisol is bad for the brain.
Especially chronically high levels during development, yes. It can actually impair the growth and function of areas like the hippocampus, affecting learning and memory. It can also affect the prefrontal cortex, impacting executive functions, and alter the amygdala's reactivity, making the child more sensitive to perceived threats.
Is this the idea of toxic stress?
Precisely. Groups like a National Scientific Council on the Developing Child use that term to describe the kind of severe, prolonged stress experience without the buffer of supportive adult relationships. Toxic stress can fundamentally alter brain architecture and stress response systems, increasing the long-term risk for anxiety, depression, learning problems, and difficulties with impulse control.
And there's evidence linking this to things like poverty.
Yes. The material mentions research showing, for example, reduced gray matter volume in the prefrontal cortex among children experiencing chronic poverty. And this structural difference is linked to poorer academic outcomes. It's a stark illustration of how the social environment gets under the skin to affect brain structure.
It really does show the environment leaving a physical trace.
It does. And that brings us to an even more intricate level, epigenetics.
Right, epigenetics. That's about how our experiences can affect how our genes work.
Exactly. It's not about changing the underlying DNA code itself, your genes remain the same, but about changes in gene expression. Think of epigenetic marks like DNA methylation as little chemical tags that attach to the DNA. These tags act like switches or volume dials, influencing whether a gene is turned on or off or how active it is.
And our early experiences can actually flick these switches.
That's the key finding. Early life experiences, particularly during sensitive developmental periods, can trigger these epigenetic changes. And importantly, these changes can be remarkably stable and long-lasting, sometimes persisting throughout life. They can affect genes involved in critical systems like stress regulation, emotional processing, and cognitive function.
Is there direct evidence for this?
Yes, quite a bit, starting with animal models. Classic studies by researchers like Meany and Seif on rats showed that the amount of licking and grooming a mother rat gave her pup in the first week of life literally changed the epigenetic markings on genes related to the pup's stress response system, the HPA axis.
So more nurturing led to different gene expression.
Yes. Pups with high nurturing mothers had epigenetic changes that led to a more regulated, less reactive stress response that lasted into their adulthood. Pups with low nurturing mothers had different epigenetic patterns and were more stress reactive.
And have they found similar things in humans?
They have. Studies, like one mentioned by McGowan and colleagues, looked at the brains of individuals who died by suicide and had a history of childhood abuse. They found distinct epigenetic changes in genes related to stress regulation compared to control groups. These findings suggest a biological pathway linking early adversity to increased vulnerability for mental health problems via lasting epigenetic modifications.
That's incredible. So experiences aren't just psychological. They're leaving these biological signatures that influence how our bodies operate long term.
It really deepens our understanding of how profoundly experiences become embedded in our biology. It suggests early life can, in a sense, program our physiological responses. And excitingly, it also opens up the possibility that positive interventions might, over time, potentially influence or reverse some of these epigenetic marks, offering hope for mitigating the effects of early adversity.
Okay, you've got the theories, we've got the brain science. Now let's get really practical and look at the kinds of specific childhood experiences that the material emphasizes as having a major impact. Parenting styles seem like a big one.
Definitely. Diana Baumrein's work here is foundational. She observed families and identified 4 distinct patterns or styles of parenting based on 2 key dimensions: how demanding or controlling parents are, and how warm or responsive they are.
And those 4 are?
Authoritative, authoritarian, permissive, and neglectful. Each combines those dimensions differently and tends to be associated with different child outcomes.
Let's start with authoritative. That sounds positive.
It's generally seen as the most beneficial style. Authoritative parents are high on both warmth responsiveness and reasonable demandingness control. They're affectionate, they listen to their kids, they encourage independence, but they also set clear rules and limits, explain the reasons behind them, and enforce them consistently.
A balance of warmth and structure.
Exactly. And the outcomes. Research consistently links this style with children who are more emotionally secure, have higher self-esteem, do better academically, are more socially competent, and tend to be more resilient. The material mentions studies like from the Australian longitudinal study, finding fewer behavioral problems and better school results for kids with authoritative parents.
Okay, how does that contrast with authoritarian?
Authoritarian parents are high on demandingness, but low on warmth. Think my way or the highway. They emphasize strict obedience, have rigid rules, often use punishment, sometimes harsh, and offer little explanation or warmth. Control is paramount.
What's the impact of that style?
Children raised this way might be obedient, but they often tend to be more anxious, have lower self-esteem, may struggle with initiating things on their own, or might become resentful and rebellious, especially in adolescence. They might also have poorer social skills.
Then there's permissive parenting.
Right. Permissive parents are the opposite. In a way, high on warmth, but very low on demandingness or control. They're loving and accepting, but set few limits, make few demands, and tend to be indulgent. They act more like a friend than a parent sometimes.
Which might sound nice, but could lead to problems with self-control.
That's often the outcome. Children with permissive parents frequently struggle with impulsivity, poor self-regulation, lack of discipline, and may have difficulty respecting rules or authority figures later on. They haven't learned to manage limits.
And the 4th style, neglectful.
This style is low on both dimensions, low warmth and low demandingness. Neglectful parents are generally uninvolved, detached, sometimes rejecting. They provide little guidance, support, or supervision, and may fail to meet the child's basic needs.
The consequences there sound pretty dire.
They often are. Neglect is consistently linked to a wide range of negative outcomes, including insecure attachment, poor academic performance, low self-esteem, developmental delays, and a significantly higher risk for delinquency and mental health problems.
And the material uses examples to illustrate the contrast.
Yes, highlighting how, for instance, authoritative parents who talk through problems with their child help them build coping skills and resilience. Compare that to a child experiencing neglect, who might develop deep-seated issues with trust and self-worth that make forming healthy relationships incredibly challenging throughout life.
Moving beyond the general parenting climate, the material also focuses heavily on adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs.
ACEs are a really crucial concept. They refer to specific, potentially traumatic events that occur before age 18. The standard list includes different forms of abuse, physical, emotional, sexual, and neglect, both physical and emotional.
And also things happening in the household.
Right, what's called household dysfunction. This includes witnessing domestic violence, living with someone who has a substance abuse problem or mental illness, experiencing parental separation or divorce, or having an incarcerated household member.
And the big takeaway from the original ACE study.
The groundbreaking finding from Felitti and Onda and their colleagues was this clear dose-response relationship, meaning the more ACEs someone experienced, the higher their risk for a whole host of negative outcomes later in life. It wasn't just whether you had one ACE, the cumulative impact mattered enormously.
And the risks weren't just for things like depression or addiction.
No, that was part of the shock. While higher ACE scores absolutely correlated with increased risk for mental health issues like depression, anxiety, suicide attempts, and substance abuse, they were also strongly linked to major physical health problems in adulthood.
Like what kind of physical problems?
Things like heart disease, stroke, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, COPD, diabetes, liver disease, even certain types of cancer. Experiencing 4 or more ACEs, for example, dramatically increased the odds for many of these conditions compared to having 0 ACEs.
How is that possible? How does childhood stress link to adult physical illness decades later?
The primary explanation involves the long-term physiological consequences of chronic stress activation, as we discussed with the brain. Experiencing multiple ACEs keeps the body's stress response system, producing cortisol, adrenaline, firing constantly during critical developmental periods. This wear and tear on the system.
Called allostatic load.
Exactly, allostatic load. It disrupts immune function, promotes chronic inflammation, affects metabolic processes, and basically compromises multiple bodily systems over time. The material uses the example of a child witnessing domestic violence, developing hypervigilance, always being on edge. This adaptive response in childhood becomes a maladaptive chronic stressor in adulthood, contributing to both mental and physical health issues.
So the body remembers, even if the mind tries to forget.
That's a good way to put it. The biological systems are altered. And it's important to note, as the material does, that interventions like trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, TFCBT, exist and are effective in helping children process trauma and potentially buffer some of these long-term health consequences.
Another major factor discussed is socioeconomic status, or SES.
SES is hugely influential because it fundamentally shapes the resources, opportunities, and stressors a child is exposed to. Growing up in poverty or low SES conditions often means facing multiple overlapping challenges.
Such as?
Things like food insecurity, not always knowing where the next meal is coming from, unstable or poor quality housing, exposure to higher levels of neighborhood violence or environmental toxins like lead paint. These aren't just inconveniences, they are significant chronic stressors that directly impact development.
And can trap families in a cycle.
Very much so. Early disadvantages linked to low SES, like poorer health, less access to quality early education, chronic stress impacting cognitive function can make it harder for children to succeed in school and later in the job market, potentially perpetuating poverty into the next generation. Research cited, like work by Duncan and Brooks Gunn, clearly shows links between low family income and poor academic and behavioral outcomes for children.
What are the mechanisms there, beyond the obvious lack of money for things?
Well, the chronic stress associated with financial insecurity and deprivation impacts brain development, particularly executive function and emotional regulation, as we've seen. Plus, there's often reduced access to enriching experiences, fewer books in the home, fewer safe places to play, fewer opportunities for stimulating activities. And crucially, lower SES is often linked to attending lower quality schools due to funding inequalities, which directly limits educational opportunities and cognitive development.
Are there ways to counteract these effects?
Yes. The material mentions compensatory programs like Head Start in the U.S. These programs aim to provide high-quality early education, health screenings, nutritional support, and family services specifically for children from low-income backgrounds, trying to level the playing field somewhat during those critical early years.
Okay, let's broaden the lens again to cultural influences. How does the wider culture shape childhood?
Culture provides this sort of invisible script for life. It shapes fundamental beliefs about child rearing, what's valued in children, like obedience versus independence, educational goals, social behavior, pretty much everything.
Can you give an example of contrasting cultural values?
Sure. The material often contrasts collectivist cultures, common in many parts of Asia, Africa, and Latin America, with individualistic cultures, typical of North America and Western Europe. In collectivist societies, there's a strong emphasis on the group, family, community. Interdependence, harmony, fulfilled obligations, and loyalty are highly valued.
Which might foster strong social ties.
Absolutely. But maybe with less focus on individual autonomy compared to individualistic cultures, where the emphasis is more on personal achievement, independence, self-expression, and uniqueness.
And this difference shapes how children even see themselves.
Yes, profoundly. Cross-cultural psychology research, like that by Marcus and Kitayama, talks about the self-concept. In collectivist cultures, people tend to develop an interdependent self, defining themselves in terms of their relationships and group memberships. I am a son. I am a member of this community. In individualistic cultures, it's more often an independent self, defining oneself based on internal traits and personal goals. I am smart. I'm ambitious.
And that difference influences choices.
It certainly can. For example, someone with an interdependent self might prioritize family needs over personal career ambitions if they conflict, whereas someone with an independent self might feel more compelled or freer to pursue individual goals, even if it means moving away from family. Understanding these cultural frameworks is essential for anyone working with children and families, ensuring that support is culturally sensitive and relevant.
Okay, so we've painted a picture of many potential challenges and influences. But not all children who face adversity have poor outcomes. This brings us to the crucial topic of resilience.
Resilience is such an important concept. It's not about being untouched by difficulty. It's about the ability to adapt positively, to bounce back, or even thrive despite experiencing significant stress or trauma.
And certain things help build that resilience, protective factors.
Exactly. Protective factors act like buffers. They don't eliminate the risk, but they help counteract it, tipping the scales towards better outcomes. The material highlights several key ones.
And supportive relationships seem top of the list.
Unquestionably. Having at least one stable, caring, and supportive relationship with a competent adult is consistently found to be the single most powerful protective factor. This would be a parent, a grandparent, a teacher, a mentor, anyone who provides consistent care and connection.
Is there research backing that up strongly?
Oh yes, the classic Kauai longitudinal study by Werner and Smith is a prime example. They followed children on the island of Kauai, many of whom grew up in poverty with various risk factors. They found that a key factor distinguishing the children who developed into competent, confident adults, despite their difficult starts, was the presence of a supportive relationship with an adult figure outside their immediate troubled family.
Just one person can make that much difference.
It can provide that crucial anchor, that sense of mattering, that guidance. The example of a mentor helping a child navigate stress at home is a perfect illustration of this protective power.
What other factors help? Access to resources.
Yes, access to things like good schools, quality healthcare, safe neighborhoods, and positive community resources like libraries, after-school programs, sports teams. These all contribute to resilience by providing opportunities, support, and a sense of belonging. Programs like Big Brothers Big Sisters are mentioned, showing how structured mentoring can improve kids' academics, self-esteem, and social skills.
And what about factors within the child themselves? Individual traits?
Certain personal characteristics also play a role. Things like having an easy temperament as a baby, developing good problem-solving skills, having a sense of self-efficacy, believing you can actually influence outcomes and traits like optimism and adaptability. Children who possess or develop these qualities tend to cope more effectively with adversity.
So it's not just about the environment. Internal resources matter too.
It's an interaction, definitely. But the key message is that resilience isn't some magical trait only a few possess. It arises from the interplay between the child and their environment. And importantly, many of these protective factors can be fostered and strengthened through targeted interventions supporting families, improving schools, providing mentors, teaching coping skills.
Speaking of schools, the material specifically calls out education's role as a mediator.
Yes, education is positioned as a potentially transformative experience. It's not just about learning facts. Schools are crucial social environments that can foster cognitive skills, social-emotional learning, and provide access to supportive relationships outside the family.
And early childhood education, ECE, gets special attention.
It does, because those early years are so critical for brain development. High-quality ECE programs like Montessori, Reggio Emilia, or the Head Start model are highlighted for their ability to promote holistic development, fostering not just pre-academic skills, but also creativity, collaboration, problem-solving, and emotional intelligence.
And there's solid evidence for the long-term benefits.
Absolutely. The Perry Preschool Project is a famous example cited. It was a randomized controlled trial that provided high-quality preschool to disadvantaged African-American children. Following them into adulthood showed remarkable long-term positive effects. Higher high school graduation rates, higher earnings, less reliance on welfare, and significantly lower rates of criminal activity compared to the control group who didn't attend the program.
That's incredibly powerful evidence for early investment.
It really is. It demonstrates that quality ECE can genuinely alter life trajectories, especially for children facing disadvantage.
But the flip side is that access isn't equal.
And that's a major issue highlighted. Unequal access to quality education unfortunately reinforces existing inequalities. Children from marginalized communities often attend schools with fewer resources, larger class sizes, and less experienced teachers, which limits the potential positive impact of education and can widen the gap caused by earlier adverse experiences or poverty.
So, addressing these educational disparities is key.
It's presented as a critical policy lever. Things like more equitable school funding formulas, investments in teacher training and support for high-need schools, and efforts towards universal access to high-quality pre-K are discussed as potential ways to make education a more effective buffer and opportunity provider for all children.
It's clear these early experiences cast a very long shadow. Let's summarize the far-reaching long-term implications across the lifespan.
They truly echo throughout life, influencing almost every domain.
Mental health and relationships seem directly linked back to those early attachment patterns in ACEs.
Definitely. As we discussed, secure attachment fosters healthier adult relationships, while insecure attachment is linked to difficulties with intimacy, trust, or managing conflict. And the link between ACEs and higher rates of depression, anxiety, PTSD, and substance use disorders in adulthood is very well established.
What about career success?
The cognitive skills nurtured or hindered in childhood, things like critical thinking, problem solving, focus, planning, are foundational for academic achievement, which in turn strongly predicts career paths and earning potential. Access to quality education and stimulating environments early on builds that essential toolkit.
And perhaps the most sobering link is to physical health.
It is sobering, but crucial to understand. The ACE research fundamentally shifted our view here. That strong dose-response relationship between the number of ACEs and the risk of developing major chronic diseases, heart disease, diabetes, cancer, autoimmune conditions later in life is undeniable.
And the mechanism is that chronic stress response wearing down the body over time.
That's the leading explanation, yes. The constant physiological stress associated with early adversity seems to lead to long-term changes in the immune system, chronic inflammation, the endocrine system, hormone dysregulation, and metabolic processes, making the body more vulnerable to a wide range of physical illnesses years, even decades later.
It really underscores that mind and body are not separate, especially when it comes to early experiences.
Not at all. Early adversity is increasingly seen as a root cause contributing to poor health outcomes across the lifespan, making it a major public health concern, not just a mental health or social issue.
Given all this, what are the pathways forward? What can be done through interventions and policy?
The consensus is that it requires a multi-pronged approach. There's no single magic bullet. We need action at the individual, family, community, and societal levels.
What kinds of individual level interventions are mentioned?
These often involve direct therapeutic support. Evidence-based therapies like TFCBT for children who've experienced trauma are highlighted as effective in reducing symptoms. Mentoring programs that provide that crucial supportive relationship are another key individual-level strategy.
And at the community level?
This involves building resources and support systems within communities to help families thrive. Examples include high-quality, affordable childcare, parent education classes teaching positive parenting skills, home visiting programs like the Nurse-Family Partnership mentioned, where nurses support vulnerable first-time mothers. These have shown good results in improving parenting practices and child outcomes.
And then the big picture policy recommendations.
This is about changing the systemic conditions that create adversity or limit opportunity. The material advocates for policies like significantly increasing investment in quality early childhood education and making it universally accessible. Expanding access to affordable mental health care for children and families is crucial. And tackling root causes like poverty and discrimination through strategies like strengthening economic supports for families. Example, child tax credits, higher minimum wage, ensuring safe and affordable housing, and addressing systemic inequities.
So really aiming for systemic change, not just patching problems.
That's the goal for broad, lasting impact.
Looking ahead, what are the future directions in research and understanding?
It's a rapidly evolving field. Neuroscience tools, like advanced brain imaging, are giving us ever more detailed views of how experiences sculpt brain circuits. Epigenetics research continues to uncover the molecular mechanisms linking environment to gene expression, and developmental psychologists are constantly refining intervention strategies and tracking their long-term effectiveness.
What gaps remain? What's next?
There's always a need for more rigorous, long-term, longitudinal studies to track the impacts of both adversity and interventions over decades. Exploring how new technologies, maybe even AI, could personalize learning or support positive parenting is another area. But fundamentally, a major theme emerging for the future is a stronger emphasis on prevention.
Shifting the focus from fixing problems after they happen to stopping them from happening in the first place.
Exactly. Investing in creating the conditions, safe neighborhoods, supportive families, quality early learning environments, economic stability that allow all children to get off to a healthy start. The ultimate aim is to build societal structures that inherently promote positive early development.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, the core message is crystal clear. Those earliest years are profoundly, fundamentally important.
They truly lay the foundation. And understanding that influence means connecting the dots from attachment theory and cognitive stages
to the intricate ways experiences shape the physical brain through plasticity and epigenetics.
Recognizing how different factors like parenting, ACEs, poverty, and culture exert their influence.
And appreciating the power of resilience and the protective factors that foster it.
And seeing that making a difference requires a concerted effort from individual therapy and support.
All the way up to community programs and broad societal policies. It's a complex system, but understanding it is vital.
It certainly is.
It definitely makes you think about your own life, doesn't it? How might some of these insights help you understand your own patterns or reactions as an adult? And maybe more importantly, how can we as a society do better at ensuring every child gets the nurturing start they need to build that strong foundation?
Big questions, definitely worth pondering.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining us for this exploration.
It was a fascinating deep dive into some really crucial material.
Before you go, please make sure to like, share, and subscribe to this YouTube channel. Your support helps us continue these deep dives.